successfully. After all, how many followers of the old English magician have craters on the moon named after them? And how many rocket scientists inadvertently caused an entire religion to be created? And how many individuals have been credited with having done something, however esoteric or bizarre, that caused the sudden appearance of UFOs over American skies in 1947? The 1930s saw adventurers like Nicholas Roerich and Ferdinand Ossendowski ranging over the wild and savage landscapes of Asia in search of wisdom, enlightenment, and, in the case of Roerich, a solution to the world's problems. While Roerich sought peace, there were those in the world who had other ideas. And while Roerich sought to discover Shambhala and Ossendowski Agartha, there were visionaries of another sort who thought they could reach some kind of natural nirvana through mechanical means. These were the Rocketeers. Wernher von Braun is perhaps the most famous of the German rocket scientists. While he and his small group of colleagues in Europe, men like Hermann Oberth, another famous name in rocketry, were working on finding a way to build machines that would reach the moon, they would find themselves in contact with their opposite numbers on the other side of the world. Men like Robert Goddard, one of the earliest proponents in America of rocket science, had been ridiculed for believing that a rocket would one day reach the moon. His fellow scientists scoffed at the suggestion because science knew that there was nothing that could leave the Earth's gravitational field, and anyway, it was impossible to fly a machine through the vacuum of space. The ridicule he received left Goddard a recluse, and he disappeared into a private laboratory in the New Mexico desert. At Roswell. And men like Jack Parsons would phone Wernher von Braun long distance from Los Angeles to Germany, and the two would have long conversations about types of fuel, propulsion systems, and rocket design. They could get away with this because no one took rocketry seriously. Not in the United States, not in Germany. Then, Hitler came to power, and everything changed. The Horten brothers, Walter and Reimar, were busy designing gliders and coming up with novel designs for aircraft that would use turbojets, or whose fuselage would be one enormous wing. They were eccentric too, especially Reimar, dreamers who believed they could propel a human being through space at impossible speeds. But Walter and Reimar Horten had been members of Hitler Youth, and then members of the Nazi Party. They were believers and dreamers of another type. Hitler had changed the equation of science and state to represent a deeper vision of how the world should work, an absolute state in which corporate power and scientific genius would be employed in the service of a pagan fantasy of a superior race. If one could not find Agartha, one could at least create one on the surface of the planet. In India, nationalist groups who wanted to be liberated from British colonial control idealized Hitler even more than his own people were able to do. They called him the Kalki Avatar, the godlike genius who would cleanse the world of the evildoers and bring about a new golden age, brandishing rays from the sun that would melt the shields of the offenders and destroy the armies of the unclean. After all, Hitler's symbol was their symbol, the swastika. The era of the superweapons had arrived. The Germans had developed superweapons. The V-1 flying bomb, the Buzz bomb, and the V-2 guided missile systems were operational and of considerable lethality. The Luftwaffe's Me-262 was the world's first operational jet aircraft, and some of their engineers were engaged in developing alternate propulsion systems. As we will discuss, the Horten brothers had designed a flying wing jet aircraft. Known as the Horten HO-229, it was also one of the world's first stealth fighters due to its narrow vertical profile and lack of a fuselage. When powered by turbojet engines, it had tremendous speed for its time and no propeller silhouettes for the radar to lock onto. And of course, the Germans were heavily engaged on developing an atomic bomb. The Quantum Magicians. The illogical nature of the newly coined quantum physics, in which the simple act of observation seems to affect the physical world, and in which changes performed on one physical system could have an immediate effect on another quite unlinked system, the theory of non-locality, would have seemed to Parsons to endorse the improbable possibilities of magic, and especially the transformative powers of the magician himself. George Pendle. Elsewhere, we have written about the Nazi Party being less of a political party the way we understand the term, and more of a cult. Certainly, with their swastika symbol, emblazoned everywhere, Nuremberg rallies, racial theories, and the mystique of German origins in the mythical lands of Thule, which became conflated in places with Shambhala and Agartha, the Nazis seemed quite cultish, and moreover, they had their charismatic leader in Adolf Hitler. With Walter and Reimar Horten, we had two brothers who came up through the ranks of the Nazi Party, from Hitler Youth to official party membership, and dedicated service to the cause of Hitler's secret weapons. With Jack Parsons, we have a similar figure, a man who was playing with rockets at the same time that the Hortens were playing with gliders. Parsons did not belong to the Nazi Party, however, but to the Ordo Templi Orientis, the magical order whose head was Aleister Crowley. And he would eventually proclaim himself the Antichrist. To most listeners, this will seem like pure insanity. The problem is that Parsons was a critical part of the early American space program as well as of the defense industry. There is a crater on the far side of the moon named after him. He was a co-founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He was the archetypal rocket scientist. Wernher von Braun, 1912 to 1977, was in contact with Parsons nearly a decade before the war broke out. At one point, Parsons grew nervous, believing that von Braun was trying to coax classified rocketry information out of him. According to one source, so far unverified, Wernher von Braun declared that it was Parsons, not he, who was the real father of the American space program. Considering his background and his accomplishments in everything from solid rocket fuel formations to JATO design to the establishment of the JPL and later the Aerojet Corporation in a career that spanned barely 2 decades, this is not hyperbole. Parsons was also in contact with Robert Goddard, 1882 to 1945, the inventor and engineer who built the world's first liquid fuel rocket. According to von Braun, it was Goddard's rocket designs, especially in regard to the liquid fuel propulsion system, that saved the Nazis years of development work when it came to creating the V-2. This was due to information on Goddard's work that was stolen by German military intelligence as early as 1936. In the years before the outbreak of World War II, relations between American and German rocket engineers were collegial. In the United States, the Army had little or no interest in rockets before the war broke out. They failed to see any military application of the technology. But in Germany, military interest in rocket science was somewhat greater. It was still a fledgling technology when Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, but by that time, the interest in superweapons had taken off, and the equivalent of millions of dollars was being expended in the research and development phase of all sorts of secret military technology, from rockets to alternate energy and propulsion systems to the atomic bomb itself. This also required a new approach to physics. Einstein's famous relativity theory had military applications, as the world learned in August 1945. As early as 1939, Einstein had warned President Roosevelt of Germany's growing interest in the possibility of atomic weapons. Indeed, Germany's 1932 Nobel Prize winner in physics, Werner Heisenberg, remained in Germany to help the Nazis develop their own atomic bomb. Heisenberg is perhaps best known as the father of quantum mechanics and for his uncertainty principle, which states that the position and the momentum of a particle cannot be known simultaneously. In 1942, Heisenberg famously reported to German Armaments Minister Albert Speer that Germany could not build an atomic bomb before 1945, which turned out to be a prescient statement, since that is precisely when the United States delivered their first atomic bomb. German scientists seemed to dominate the scene in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. Winners of the Nobel Prize for Physics during that period included Einstein, 1921, Niels Bohr, 1922, Heisenberg, 1932, and Wolfgang Pauli, 1945, among others. What was taking place, however, was not simply new advances in technology or in technological applications of scientific discoveries, but an entirely new way of looking at reality. It began with Einstein and his theories of relativity, the general and the special. The special theory of relativity pertains to elementary particles, while the general theory pertains to gravity and the gravitational field. That means that the special theory has particular importance where small-scale effects are concerned, whereas the general theory has applications that obtain with larger-scale systems, such as those in astronomy and cosmology. In terms of space travel, the important takeaway from Einstein's theory is that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. This sets a cap on how fast anything can travel to the planets and the stars beyond our solar system, and basically calculates travel in terms of years, not hours or days. This has serious implications for the design of spacecraft that could travel to the moon or satellites, or space probes sent to the planets, and is probably the single most formidable obstacle to the idea that alien spacecraft visit the Earth on a regular basis, or somehow communicate with us across vast distances of space. The other implication is somewhat stranger. If one could travel at or near the speed of light to another planet and then come back to Earth, one would find that many years had passed on Earth during what was to the traveler a very short time of travel. The traveler would still be young, but her friends and neighbors would have aged considerably. As the science of physics began to undergo some important modifications during the 1930s and 1940s, however, new concepts were developed that, while consistent with the theories of relativity, challenged some basic ideas about the construction of matter, energy, and reality itself. This was quantum mechanics. Today, many scientists become impatient with popular ideas about quantum physics and quantum mechanics, as laypeople seize on some of the terminology and give it a distinctly spiritualized spin. Concepts like indeterminacy and uncertainty, as well as non-location, seem to represent evidence for the existence of high strangeness in the physical world, and proof of the possibility of such phenomena as ESP, precognition, etc. These ideas make some physicists' heads hurt. They point to the complete lack of understanding of these concepts on the part of the general public. Indeed, an understanding of quantum physics is beyond the capability of all but a relative handful of specialists, and even then, it requires mastery of advanced forms of mathematics and scientific knowledge even to take part in a discussion. The computation and discussion of quantum possibilities has led some critics to complain that quantum physics is more about statistics than it is about empirical evidence, which was, after all, the basis on which Einstein formulated the theory of relativity. However, the application of quantum mechanics to real-world technologies, such as the microchip, the laser, and MRI technology, demonstrates that there is more going on with the quantum world than merely philosophical speculations about the hidden nature of reality. Those who understood this the best at the time quantum theories were being developed were the very scientists who had to struggle with the ramifications of what they were proving. For what quantum theory suggested was that one of the basic tenets of the scientific method, that results be predictable and repeatable, was in doubt. This gave Einstein a headache. He could not accept that the universe was structured in such a way that it was not a closed system with all of its moving parts knowable and predictable if one just had the necessary data. He felt there was a flaw in the theory somewhere, and that with time, quantum theory would be reconciled with classical physics. His famous saying, paraphrased many times over the years, that God does not play dice with the world, is specifically a reflection of his suspicion about quantum theory. However, in the nearly 100 years since quantum theory was developed, there has been no recognized reconciliation of classical with quantum physics. Any attempt to derive classical physics from quantum physics or vice versa has been doomed to failure. Yet applications of quantum physics to real-world technology have proven so valuable that to deny its validity would be pointless. This has led to quite a controversy in scientific circles, as well as repercussions in the studies of ontology and consciousness. Many strange theories were advanced to explain, or to accommodate, some of the quantum effects, including ideas about multiple universes or a multiverse, the idea that one particle could affect another particle even though there was no intermediary medium of transmission of energy, etc. If classical science is about narrative, like the novel, a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, that is, predictability and repeatability, quantum physics is more like stream of consciousness, or even free verse, in the sense that it does not provide determinacy. It still makes use of the same alphabet and the same vocabulary, but grammatical rules may be stretched and meaning may be difficult to determine. This is especially so when we consider that there is still no generally agreed-upon way of explaining how or why it works, and what its relationship is to classical physics. This was the environment in which the Rocketeers came of age. In Germany, Wernher von Braun was reading science fiction. In the United States, so was Jack Parsons. In fact, Parsons gathered around himself a kind of salon of science fiction authors and enthusiasts. In Roswell, Robert Goddard jealously guarded his research, having been stung much earlier in his life when word of his theories concerning space travel leaked to the press, and he was ridiculed by other scientists who did not believe that rockets could ever leave the Earth's atmosphere. But Goddard himself had been inspired by reading science fiction, most notably H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds, and had a kind of epiphany when he was an adolescent, a moment of satori in which he suddenly saw the rocket he would build as if it already had been designed. in Pasadena in the years before the war broke out, as Parsons and his childhood friend Ed Foreman were feverishly involved in designing and building their own rockets. Such notables as Werner Heisenberg and Niels Bohr would lecture at Caltech, and while it is not known for certain if Parsons or Foreman attended these lectures, it is likely that they did. One of those who was in residence at Caltech at the time was J. Robert Oppenheimer, 1904 to 1967, the man considered by many to be the father of the atomic bomb. Oppenheimer was also young, only 32 in 1936, but had already mastered quantum physics, nuclear physics, and Sanskrit. Like Parsons, Oppenheimer was a man of many parts. He had a strong interest in Asian religion and learned Sanskrit in order to read the Bhagavad Gita and other Indian texts in their original language. It was due to this interest that Oppenheimer was later able to utter his famous reaction on learning that his atomic bomb worked. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," from his reading of the Gita. Oppenheimer's wide interests, especially in religion and mysticism, were blamed for his failure to win a Nobel Prize in physics. Some colleagues remarked that he seemed to view the outer edges of scientific discovery as being mysterious and perhaps even sacred, a point of view that, in the intellectual climate of the day, was considered unscientific and credulous. By studying Indian religion as well as physics, it is claimed that he lost ground in science and was not able to pursue research that would have led to groundbreaking revelations. But that came after the war. As the chief of the scientific division of the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer's brief was to build an atomic bomb, and that he did. It was Oppenheimer who later realized that what he had done had implications far beyond science. One could say that he was the one who opened a door and something flew in. Oppenheimer would be accused of being a communist and was always in danger of having his security clearance revoked. While protected during the war since he was essential to the Manhattan Project, after the war he became a target of inquiry during the McCarthy era of the 1950s, a time during which Parsons was also being investigated with the subsequent loss of his security clearance. Ironically, it was during this same period that Nazi scientists brought over under various programs, but most notably Paperclip, scientists whose work for the Third Reich resulted in thousands of deaths of innocent civilians and concentration camp inmates, were able to conduct their own research in defense and space technology unmolested. In other words, actual proven enemies of the United States who worked for a regime that resulted in the deaths of 40 million people, including 20 million Russian soldiers and civilians, were being protected, while native-born Americans who had contributed to the war effort in defense of the United States were being branded as ideologically impure. This intellectual environment that was part political ideology, part science fiction, and part the new physics represented by Einstein, Heisenberg, Bohr, Oppenheimer, and the quantum theorists, contributed to a kind of cortical fission in Parsons's brain. In the 1930s, he was already fascinated with ancient religions and occultism. It would have been asking too much for Parsons to keep these interests in separate boxes. He was a dreamer and an idealist, and as someone largely self-taught in rocketry, he had tremendous confidence in his own abilities as well as his own perceptions. The autodidact is often eccentric, learning outside the prescribed channels, outside the accepted narrative. He or she develops a wide range of knowledge that is assembled in a weird kind of mental structure that is unique and unfathomable to those whose education took a more prosaic route. One's learning is seen as uneven, lopsided, missing some key elements, since the autodidact usually pursues interests that she or he finds stimulating and satisfying while ignoring some of the basic building blocks of the field. Parsons was fortunate in that the field he was most interested in, rocketry, was a young science with very few practitioners. Virtually everyone in rocketry in those days was self-taught, although some did have academic backgrounds in engineering or physics. Parsons went where he could go in order to learn what he could learn and chatted up local scientists and engineers to pick their brains and talk about space, rockets, and fuel systems. He was widely seen as brilliant, and Wernher von Braun was only too delighted to talk rockets with this enthusiastic young American from the exotic land of California. Yet there was another current running through Parsons's imagination, one that dovetailed with his interest in space travel. In fact, and as we have discussed previously, religious mysticism and space travel are often and inextricably linked, possibly an inheritance from the days when the heavens were considered the realm of the gods. What made Parsons unique was that he was pursuing space travel as well as its more ethereal form in mysticism and magic. In Parsons, science and religion would become mixed to such an extent that one commentator actually accused him of having opened a hole in the ether, a kind of stargate through which the contemporary UFO phenomenon would enter our world. As fanciful as that sounds, it cannot be doubted that Parsons was at the forefront of rocket technology and was plugged into the whole realm of rocket science, space travel, defense technology, science fiction, and even international espionage. During the McCarthy era, Parsons was suspected of being a communist agent, and indeed one of his colleagues was accused of just that, arrested and detained. Parsons at one time worked for the Hughes Corporation, was involved in negotiations for missile technology transfer with the State of Israel at a time when Israel was in danger of having Nazi-designed missiles fired at them from Egypt, was investigated by the FBI, lost his security clearance, and introduced L. Ron Hubbard to Crowleyan magic in the Mojave Desert, thus providing a theoretical basis for what would become known as Scientology. And during all of this, Parsons had embarked on a program of ritual magic, conjuration, summoning elementals, invoking an ancient Sumerian goddess, and declaring himself to be nothing less than the Antichrist. And then he died in an explosion when he was only 37 years old. Thus, some of the more poetic observers may be excused from asserting that Parsons extended his consciousness, and therefore his influence, far in excess of what most of us are capable of, and that this influence was entirely focused on breaking free from the Earth's gravitational field, both literally and figuratively. And anyway, isn't that what this project is all about? While Parsons may not have been alone in opening a hole in the ether so that something flew in, he represents for us an important icon of the event, since he combines all of these various disparate threads of the phenomenon in one person, one career. Ad Astra, to the stars. Various writers have suggested that extra-mundane intelligences are apprehensive about nuclear disturbances originating on Earth. The UFO flap that commenced after Hiroshima was considered by some to be part of an